The Prince of Wales and Camilla Parker Bowles were seen together in public, quite clearly coming down the steps of the Ritz after the party for the 50th birthday party for Camilla's sister. There's a rule in the monarchy that feels simple but matters more than most people think. Only one person is sovereign at a time. That idea is straight and clear. The crown sits on a single head, and others serve beneath it. That basic fact explains why small changes in who does what quickly become big stories. When the household reshuffles duties, it is never just about diaries and photo opportunities. It is about who represents the institution, how the family manages public trust, and which faces the public will come to rely on. Recently, a wide and quiet reorganization inside the royal household produced an announcement that rattled more than a few people. And according to sources buzzing behind palace walls, it left Queen Camilla deeply unhappy. The move wasn't one sudden press release so much as a set of carefully made decisions that together felt like a shock to some and like necessary housekeeping to others. At the heart of the change was a far-reaching review of royal patronages and presidencies. After a new reign begins, the household traditionally looks at which charities and institutions can realistically be kept under royal patronage and which might be passed on or allowed to go. This time the exercise was large in scale. The team looked at more than 1,000 links between royals and organizations and slowly worked through who would remain, who would gain new links, and which connections would end. The review was presented as practical and necessary, a way to match the family's official duties to the time and energy available from a smaller number of working royals. But the result was a list of winners and losers. And that list stirred strong feelings in some corners. When those recommendations became public, the effects were immediate. Hundreds of charities that for so long had enjoyed the prestige of royal patronage found themselves reassigned or told the relationship would not continue. For many of these organizations, losing a royal patron is not merely symbolic. It can mean less publicity, fewer fundraising opportunities, and the need to rethink identity and outreach. For some groups, the news came as relief. They welcomed the chance to find new champions or to work in different ways. But for others, it felt like a loss of tradition and a sudden disruption. Reporting on the reshuffle made clear that this was not a small tidy-up. It was a fundamental remapping of who within the royal family would be the public face for charities and institutions going forward. Part of the same set of decisions touched on beloved long-standing royal roles tied to military units and ceremonial positions. Age and time take their toll. Senior royals who had served for decades began to step back, handing over colonels and other long-held duties to younger hands. One visible example saw the Duke of Kent, after many years in service, pass on the colonel of the Scots Guards to another working royal. These handovers are practical in one sense. Older members find it harder to sustain public and regimental calendars, but they also have deep symbolic weight. Regiments and organizations feel a link with the person who carried their history for decades. So when a colonel seat changes, it feels like the end of one era and the start of another. Those quiet parades and handovers may not make sensational headlines, but they reshape the fabric of royal life and remind everyone that the family is moving toward a smaller, more concentrated group of active members. At the same time, the mechanics of keeping the monarchy running were under the microscope. The vast renovation of Buckingham Palace, a project built as the most extensive in living memory, has been a central part of the household's planning. The work requires serious money and has already forced the palace to move some state events to other royal sites, while major building work continues. Because large sums from the sovereign grant are being used to pay for the refurbishment, the public conversation quickly turned to questions of cost, timing, and fairness. In a difficult economic period for many, it is easy for critics to portray the spending as out of step with ordinary lives. Even as the palace argues the work is urgent and unavoidable to prevent worse, more expensive problems later, the money matters not only for the palace's stone and steel, but for how the public reads a family's priorities, which in turn affects who gets sympathy and support during times of controversy. All of these shifts of patronage review, the reassignment of military roles, and the expensive palace project combined to tilt the daily load of public duties. It fell particularly heavily on the new queen. Camilla, who had already built a profile around certain causes when she was Duchess of Cornwall, saw responsibilities widen as the household sought to consolidate and present a coherent public face for their priorities. For some time, the palace had been moving more work to fewer people. When the king's agenda and health needs add pressure, the queen's diary naturally thickens. That extra strain quickly becomes visible in missed events, in shorter public appearances, and in keen public scrutiny of every small slip. Sources close to palace life say that when duties pile up and health or fatigue begin to show, the reactions are not neutral. Instead, they become part of a narrative about vitality, relevance, and the long-term future of the institution. It is worth remembering that being a working royal is as much about stamina as it is about symbolic presence. The household decisions force a rebalancing of who can be expected to do what over the coming years, and that rebalancing has human consequences. Camilla's calendar became fuller, and her public health became a point of attention. Reports of chest infections, bouts of illness, and occasional absences were photographed, debated, and used by critics to question whether she could carry the role in the way people expect from the memory of the previous monarch. Comparisons are hard to avoid. Queen Elizabeth's steadiness over 7 decades set an almost impossible bar. Anyone who follows will be measured against that long record. The result has been a messy mix of sympathy, critique, and political argument about the cost of monarchy and the value of continuity. The review's practical outcomes muddied the political waters. Some charities found themselves in the Queen's list of continued patronages and praise or support. Others lost royal links and had to cope without the profile they had relied on. This uneven distribution invited questions about priorities and process. Why did some groups keep royal support while others did not? Was a decision driven by public need, by personal preference, or by what would make the most visible splash? Those questions fed into a broader conversation that was already taking place about transparency and fairness and how an ancient institution adapts to modern expectations. For those watching closely, it was hard not to see how decisions that look like administrative housekeeping can land as politically charged choices in the public square. On top of the structural and financial debates, there were emotional currents. For Camilla, the job has become deeply personal as well as public. She is not only the queen at the center of a big constitutional and cultural debate, she is also a wife standing by a husband whose health has required treatment. That role to be partner and public representative at the same time stretches a person. In private circles, sources say the stress of constant travel, long days on the road, and the pressure to be visibly welcome wear anyone down. Small public slips, missed speeches, brief absences, or shaky moments caught by the cameras are often presented to the public as signs of decline, which makes public life even harder. The pileup of responsibilities, especially during a time when a household is shrinking the circle of active royals, became a central reason behind the Queen's reported frustration. It is easy to forget that royals, despite their profile, are people who age and get tired just like everybody else. When the public expects a certain relentless level of performance born from the memory of a 70-year reign, the reality of limitations produces anxiety both inside the palace and among the public. For Camilla, the added scrutiny was not only about whether she could keep up the pace, but whether the public would accept a different model of service, one that looks less like ceaseless activity and more like careful selected appearances chosen for impact and sustainability. That idea of selectivity sits uneasily with some critics who prefer to see the Queen in more visible and frequent roles. The timing of the patronage review and the palace's other changes amplified the sense that the household was trying to steer the institution through a delicate moment. On the one hand, the shakeup aimed to modernize and to make the royals' work more sustainable. On the other, it exposed tensions about who gets to represent the family and which organizations are given priority. Those tensions were especially visible in public reactions to who gained and who lost patronage. The palace framed the decisions as sensible planning, but in the media and on social platforms, the moves were read as clues about power, preference, and the direction in which the monarchy was heading. For some members of the family, the review offered relief, fewer duties, a clearer focus, and the chance to hand important roles to colleagues who could give them more energy. For others, it felt like a diminution tradition, and a cut that came without enough ceremony. The Duke of Kent stepping back from the Scots Guards, for example, was both an acknowledgement of his long service and a signal that the guard of working royals was tightening. These changes are practical and inevitable, The emotional cost is that long-linked relationships with institutions and communities feel suddenly altered or ended. People who have spent decades attending regimental events, hospital wards, and fundraising dinners do not disappear from those ties lightly. The handing over of roles, therefore, carries both practical clarity and the sense of an era ending. In public perception, the timing of big spending on the palace's refurbishment made the whole household feel fragile. When the public hears about expensive works and rising sovereign grant figures, while seeing stories of missed visits and changing patronages, a narrative forms mixing money, tradition, and managerial choice. The palace defends its actions as necessary maintenance and careful modernization. Critics say the optics are poor when the country is dealing with economic pressures. That tension is not new, but the intense focus on the figures made the reshuffle feel less like internal housekeeping and more like a public test of the monarchy's relevance and priorities. Beyond the headlines, the reshuffle has consequences for the charities themselves. Royal patronage brings visibility. It opens doors and helps organizations reach donors and volunteers. When that link is removed, charities must rethink how to keep momentum. Some will adapt by building new partnerships and refocusing their messages. Others will struggle to maintain the public attention that only a royal connection can sometimes deliver. The palace's choices therefore have ripple effects into communities that depend on reliable support. That is part of the reason the decisions are sensitive and why the fallout is not just political theater, but a matter of real-world consequence. For Camilla, the personal cost of being the visible face of a contentious reshuffle cannot be ignored. Reports of charitable shops closing or financial worries at patron organizations feed into a story in which royal support is judged by its short-term results rather than its long-term symbolic value. When a charity associated with the Queen has to scale back, critics seize on it as proof that royal backing does not always translate into saving an organization. That is a painful narrative, at times unfair. No one person, royal or otherwise, can control complex financial realities, but perception often outruns nuance in public debate. For Camilla, being tied to the institution's financial and structural choices makes every announcement heavier and every absence more visible. There is also a deeper conversation about generational transition. The review deliberately moved responsibilities toward younger working royals. That shift reflects the practical need to have those with energy and years ahead of them take on duties that require travel and sustained visibility. It also reflects a strategic desire to shape the monarchy's public face for the future. For older members like Camilla, the move to hand more international trips and high-profile engagements to the next generation can feel like a narrowing of scope. It can look in public framing like a temporary tenure rather than a lasting role. That perception may be unfair. The Queen's influence and patronage choices will resonate for years, but narrative tends to prefer tidy stories, and the idea of a temporary steward makes for a neat hook, even when reality is messier. Inside the household, the decisions were presented as careful planning. The aim was to make sure charities had consistent royal patrons and to make sure the family could sustain a credible public program without exhausting key members. But the human side of the story meant some individuals felt pushed and some felt overlooked. Camilla's reaction, described by insiders as frustration and fatigue, reflects the strain of carrying responsibility while being judged for circumstances that are only partly under her control.